And I'll hand over to Clelia to introduce Professor Calma.
Okay, thank you. Before I start, I was just advertising everyone that this meeting is recorded. So if you do not want to be seen, just the camera. So now I'm very happy and honored to introduce Professor Dragos Calma and his lecture for the Center of Study of Platonism. Professor Dragos Calma is Associate Professor in Medieval Philosophy at University College Dublin. He held research fellowships at the University of Sorbonne, the Warburg Institute, sorry for my pronunciation, the University of Bonn, and the University of Cambridge. Professor Calma is particularly interested in theories pertaining to metaphysics and theories of soul in the 13th and the 16th centuries. One of the aims of his research consists in enlarging our knowledge of the Western thought by unearthing, editing, and analyzing previously unknown philosophical texts preserved in medieval manuscripts. Since 2011, his studies focus mainly on the reception of Proclus metaphysics in the Latin West. On this topic, he directed major research grants awarded by the Romanian National Council at the University Babes-Bolyai, sorry again for my pronunciation, and the French National Research Agency at the École Pratique des Hautes Études. At the University College Dublin, he directs an RRC Consolidator Grant Project on Neoplatonism and Abrahamic traditions. The aim of the project is to build upon the preliminary achievements of the previous projects to deepen and integrate them into much wider and systematic investigation of the Neoplatonic legacy, in which the Western tradition is only a part of a global history of knowledge. Now, Professor Dragos Calma will deliver his talk, Pseudo-Proclus and not Aristotle, what Neoplatonism in the Latin West. He will talk about 55 minutes, and there will be a lot of time for the Q&A. So thank you very much.
I thank you all, and especially I want to thank Douglas for his kind invitation, which I accepted with enthusiasm. I'm very fond indeed of the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism. To its creation, I participated not least during memorable meetings at the Granta, this Cantabrigian Cora of ideas. Douglas asked me to describe for today the state of our research project on Neoplatonism and the Abrahamic traditions, which began as a project of the center and still is one of its projects, even if now we contemplate the ideas in another part of the world. I was in a dilemma, I have to confess, not knowing whether I should describe the documents that we discover and study or some of the most relevant historiographical concepts that we use or correct, because often historiographical concepts echo received views. The project covers the reception of Proclus and the Book of Causes from the 9th to the 16th centuries in the lens of Islam, Eastern and Western Christianity. Presenting it today, as I mentioned briefly to Garth earlier, would oblige me to remain somehow at the surface of things. Hence, I decided to select only one historical aspect of our research and to analyze in some detail only one theme. I'm lazy, as I said, and I will invite you to check the website where we upload information constantly about the findings, publications, conferences, and so on. So you can somehow have a clear idea from the website. My paper will have three parts. In the first part, I will try to explain the first half of my title. In the second part, I will examine the impact of Islamic sources on Western debates about the Eucharist. And I will, in this case, try to answer the question that I have in the title. And finally, we will try to propose some general conclusions. I will begin with an apparently unusual question. What is not the Book of Causes? You find on this slide the answer to my question. The Book of Causes is not a compilation, nor an abridged version of the Elements of Theology. These opinions that you can see here, taken from scholarly papers in English and French, but one can find similar sentences in many other languages, present exactly what I want to reject briefly today. But the purpose of my paper is not to be polemical. Hence, I will not give the names of the scholars who wrote these sentences. I only want to show how widespread is the idea that among scholars, and not only scholars, is the idea that the Book of Causes is a compilation or an adaptation or a summary or a resume of the Elements of Theology. And unfortunately, this widespread idea reflects, will easily misguide us when studying the history of the Book of Causes. Well, the origin of this claim that you see here is surprisingly or not a medieval source, that is Thomas Aquinas, who explicitly stated that the Book of Causes is nothing more than the deliberate result of an Arabic author who selected fragments from the Elements of Theology. Absolutely everything that is contained in the Book of Causes, in short, is already contained at length in the Elements of Theology, says Aquinas. There are pages in the commentary on the Book of Causes where Aquinas indicates differences between Proclus and the Elements and the Book of Causes, and sometimes he considers them to be the fruit of a misunderstanding or even a mistranslation. However, Aquinas is the first, as far as we can tell from the tradition that we studied, who claimed that the Book of Causes uses one source only, that is the Elements of Theology, thus emphasizing even more the idea that between the two texts, there are no major differences. Numerous scholars praise today Aquinas' philological approach and consider him the first Latin author who understood that the Book of Causes is not Aristotle. Although I do not contest that Aquinas' demonstration was very influential in the Latin West, it must be said that other authors, notably Thomas of York, situated the Book of Causes within the Platonic tradition before Aquinas' commentary and before Murbeke's translation of the Elements of Theology. But indeed, Aquinas' arguments spread quickly in the Latin West, and authors and scribes consider the Book of Causes nothing more but the abridged version of the Elements of Theology. It is not rare to see that some medievals even attributed the Book of Causes to Proclus himself. Here on this slide, I copied only a few cases. From the manuscript, for example, Erfurt Universitätsbibliothek 331, which contains a commentary on the Book of Causes by Giles of Rome. And on the leaf card, a medieval scribe indicated that it is a commentary of Giles of Rome on a book of Aristotle, Super Libro Aristotelis. A little bit later, on folio 3, the scribe attributes the text, the Liber de Causis, to Proclus, and again the same attribution on folio 8, Egidio Super de Causis Procli. Giles of Rome himself, when he discusses the paternity of the text, he simply uses a very Neoplatonic vocabulary and presents the Book of Causes as a text, or the propositions of the Book of Causes, as emanating from the elements of theology. It's a nice way to use a Neoplatonic vocabulary and explain the source here. The manuscript from Angers, Bibliothèque Municipale, that transmits the text of the Book of Causes, the Latin version of it, has a late 15th century handwriting here. I hope you can see it, writing hic liber scriptus est Proclus. This book has been written by Proclus. In some other manuscripts of transmitting the book, the elements of theology in the Latin version, so one can observe variations about the title, and I gave here only a few examples. So in the manuscript in Berlin, the book, the elements of theology is named the Proculi causes, the causes of Proclus, but a bit later at the end of the text, it is given the right name, Elementatio Theologica. One has a similar case in the manuscript, another manuscript from Erfurt, also the elements of theology. At the beginning of the text, it is written Incipit Proclus Patronicus de Causis. The Latin tradition of manuscripts, as you can see here, and the commentaries you can see here in Johannes de Malingis, which I will quote again a bit later, or even Guillaume Deleuze, have this idea or continue this idea of from Aquinas that it is a compilation or an abbreviation from the elements of theology. The Latin tradition of manuscripts provide an important historical evidence beyond the attribution to Aristotle, which has been too often commented and overestimated, in my view, by scholars. There is a certain perplexity about the authorship. Not only the causes is attributed to Proclus, as I mentioned, but the elements of theology are named or given the title Liber de Causis. I could consider and discuss here other extravagant attributions of the Book of Causes, such as an attribution to Themistius, for example, but it would lead us too far from the goal of this paper. It is clear, however, from the vocabulary used in these examples that neither Aquinas nor his followers did not see any major doctrinal difference between the two texts. They insist, Aquinas mostly, on one aspect, the length. The Book of Causes is the shorter, more accessible version of the elements of theology. From this perspective, it is not a surprise that Proclus is credited as the author of both the Book of Causes and the elements of theology. I'm sorry, yes. I want to add that these hesitations concerning the paternity of the text are noticeable in the Arabic tradition as well. A certain number of valuable research projects are currently devoted to the description of Arabical philosophical manuscripts, and most probably we will know even more about the Arabic Neoplatonic tradition in the near future. Our current information on the Arabic tradition of manuscripts of the Book of Causes lack, however, a much needed systematic approach. But I want to emphasize here that we are grateful to the work of Christina D'Ancona, Richard Taylor, Elvira Wackelnig, and obviously Gerhard Andres, who have produced valuable research in this area. In Arabic, we know two versions of the Book of Causes. Two versions of the Book of Causes. The one that had been successfully transmitted into Latin, which I will call Book of Causes 1, but was also translated into Hebrew, into Armenian, and into Georgian. And it was read in the West, and it's the version that I will examine today, and the so-called Book of Causes 2, discovered and published in 2002 only, preserved in one Arabic manuscript, which it seems did not have any impact on other philosophical traditions. In some recent publications, Elvira Wakelnik showed that both the Book of Causes 1, so the successful version, and the Book of Causes 2 differ in a certain number of doctrinal matters and are similar in other aspects, and that they both borrow phrases from a common source named by Elvira a proto Book of Causes or Ur Book of Causes, which already altered Proclus metaphysics and introduced themes and notions from other philosophical and theological sources common to the so-called Plotiniana Arabica as well. Well, what interests us from the time being is that we currently know 3 Arabic manuscripts of the Book of Causes 1, the influential Book of Causes. The oldest manuscript is from the 12th century, so 3 centuries later, after the translation of the Elements of Theology in Arabic and the production of the Book of Causes. So it's rather, well, it's not the most faithful, probably, witness, if you want. The 12th century manuscript is preserved in Leiden, and 2 other manuscripts from the 15th century are preserved in Turkey. In the Leiden manuscript, the work is explicitly attributed to Aristotle with a title close to some of the versions found in the Latin list of translations by Gerard of Cremona, that is a book of the exposition by Aristotle on the pure good, Liber Aristotelis de Expositione Bonitatis Pure. In the Ankara manuscript, which transmits a version closer to some of the Latin manuscripts of the Book of Causes, the work is attributed to Plato, and the name of Proclus is mentioned as well as the compiler, but not the author of the Book of Causes. It is said that Proclus has accepted it from the discourse of Plato, and it is said to be by Plato. According to this manuscript, Proclus is the equivalent of the Ibn Daud in Abba the Great's narration about the origin of the text. So these recent studies on the Arabic reception of Proclus enable us to put Aquinas' remarks into perspective. It is now possible to understand that his interpretation is based on a certain number of historically inaccurate assumptions. And when I say Aquinas, I also include here the Latin authors that embraced or followed him, embraced his views or followed him. The first historical inaccurate assumption is that, as I mentioned, the Elements of Theology were fully translated from Greek into Arabic. We do not know if the Elements of Theology were translated, the entire text was translated into Arabic or only parts of it. The second historically incorrect assumption is that the author or the compiler of the Book of Causes had immediate access to the Arabic version of the Elements of Theology. As I said, Elvira assumes that there is a proto Liber de Causis, a proto Book of Causes, so there's an intermediary between the version that we know and the Arabic version of the Elements of Theology. And the third historically inaccurate assumption is that once again, the author or the compiler of the Book of Causes used only the Elements of Theology and not any other philosophical or theological source. Well, the question that arises from this first impression is that should we consider these inaccurate assumptions important, significant in the way that Aquinas reads both the Book of Causes and the Elements of Theology? One could be tempted to answer by the affirmative, but the question I fear is more difficult, and I would probably not dare to analyze it here right now. However, it is unquestionable that Aquinas seems to be less sensible to the differences between the two texts than he is to the similarities between them. Or at least he is keener on stressing the similitudes and explaining, whenever possible, the Book of Causes through the Elements of Theology. But the differences are very significant. In recent years, a few scholars, notably Cristina d'Ancona and Richard Taylor, have indicated here and there some of the similarities between the texts, but we lack a comprehensive, a systematic study that would be extremely useful indeed in order to understand the transformation from the Elements of Theology into the Book of Causes. For the purpose of this talk, suffice to mention that the most characteristic Proclean themes have been eliminated by the author of the Book of Causes, or the proto-Book of Causes, such as the one, the henads, the goods. Without the one and the henads, with their specific metaphysical feature, there is no participation. And without participation, the entire dynamic of procession, prodos, and return epistrophe is modified, and so on. The verb itself, participare, occurs 444 times in the Latin translation, and it never appears in the Book of Causes. The later uses fluere and influere 33 times, and this verb never appears in the Elementatio Theologica. Also, the main doctrines of the Book of Causes are absolutely incompatible with Proclean metaphysics, such as the idea of a first cause that is equally the absolute being, tantum esse, the supreme good that creates, thinks, governs, and acts upon all singulars. The first cause's efficient causality is the result of its will. The idea of a will of the first cause is essential in the Book of Causes, but absent in, obviously, in Proclean metaphysics. Also, the intelligence is the first immediate effect of the first cause, and it is the first created being, according to the Book of Causes, ens primum creatum, right? So all these differences and many more are obvious here and important to underline the fact that the Book of Causes cannot be a compilation or the abridged version of the Elements of Theology. The metaphysics in the two texts, the main metaphysical themes are so different that it's impossible to imagine that one would be simply a summary, a resume of the other, well, in this case, the Book of Causes. Well, now, being somehow having this said, let me try to get to the, well, I have here a certain number of information about the Book of Causes in the Latin. It's a short text, probably you all know that. It's 7,400 words. However, the number of Latin manuscripts, as you can see here, it's remarkable. So we have 268 manuscripts that we discovered, many of them. And as a comparison, Aquinas' commentary on the Synthesis has 78 manuscripts for the book one, Summa Contra Gentiles has 184. The only comparable or even higher number is the Secunda Secundae of Summa Theologiae of Aquinas. And I will not mention here the printed editions and the manuscripts of the Florilegia. We've discovered over 80 Latin commentaries on the Book of Causes, 10 times more than scholars knew a few years ago. And in terms of, obviously, knowledge of the Book of Causes, I mentioned, and I will talk about the commentaries, but I will not refer here to the explicit citations. The title itself, not the propositions, which is more difficult to evaluate the number of references to the propositions without the title. So the title itself is cited explicitly 539 times, according to a Brepolis database, which presents, I don't know, probably 20-30% of the medieval texts. As a comparison, Boetius de Consolatione is cited 313 times, and Porphyry's Isagoge is cited 92 times. So it's a very known text, cited, widespread, short text, and it's obvious only from these facts that it had a certain impact on medieval metaphysics. But precisely what kind of Neoplatonism did the Book of Causes spread in the Middle Ages? In the remaining of my time, I will answer this question by examining the most commonly cited sentence of the Book of Causes, that is the first theorem, famously stating that every primary cause infuses its effect more powerfully than does a universal second cause, with its Latin version, omnis causa primaria plus est influens super causatum suum, quam causa universalis secunda. The Proclean theorem, remotely inspiring this proposition, states that all that is produced by secondary beings is in a greater measure produced from those prior and more determinative principles from which the secondary were themselves derived. One obvious immediate difference between the two texts is the use of the verb parago in Proclus, to bring forth, to produce, translated by Merbeke with producere, which is replaced or transformed or is different in the Book of Causes, where we have influere. By the way, the verb producere in Latin appears only once at the end of the third proposition in a totally different context. This difference sets the tone, I think. The Proclean theorem opens with a statement about the action of the secondary beings in order to emphasize that the prior beings also produce. And they produce in a greater measure, adding that both the effect of the secondary and the secondary beings themselves are produced by the prior beings. The first theorem of the Book of Causes opens with a statement about the quality of the action of the primary cause, or the primary causes, in order to emphasize that the effect of the secondary causes is in reality the effect of the first cause, adding that the secondary causes, have a certain influence in the production of this effect. The secondary propositions, because we have, as you probably know, the Elements of Theology and the Book of Causes are similar in terms of structure, in this axiomatic structure with the Euclid's Elements of geometry when you have one axiom and then you have a sort of commentary explaining the axiom. And we call these explanations secondary propositions. So the secondary propositions of the same theorem 1 that I just cited of the Book of Causes is inspired by theorem 70 of the Elements of Theology, where Proclus states that the gift of the more powerful principle is slower to abandon or to withdraw from the effect than the gift of the lower principle. The Book of Causes formulates two statements about the withdrawal of both the gifts, and at some point he says, quando tu removes virtutem rationalem, and the causes themselves, the secondary causes themselves, insisting at least twice on the former situation, when the second cause is separated from the effect that follows it, the first cause is not separated from the effect, and when the second cause is removed from its effect, the first cause is not removed from the effect. Well, the Elements of Theology does not mention the possibility of the withdrawal of the cause itself, but of the gifts, of the effects of the secondary beings. This is an important difference because when reflecting on the first theorem of the Book of Causes, Aquinas imagines the possibility of an efficient agency in absentia. If the secondary causes were absent, removentur, separantur, as we just saw, the effect would be produced by the first cause because the primary cause influences in a nobler manner than the secondary cause. This is, we will see Aquinas' argument, because he insists on plus influere, and he understands plus influere as agere sine secundaria, acting without the secondary. And he gives a very strong reading to a plus influere. And he uses this argument with an explicit reference to the Book of Causes in the commentary on the sentences and in his Quod Libeta 9.3 in order to explain or to provide a philosophical explanation of the Eucharist. Now, before continuing, I'm happy to mention that Ruedi Imbach, my former supervisor, was the first to draw the attention on the use of the Book of Causes in this text by Aquinas, and on the critique against Aquinas by a very well-known Latin Averroist figure, Siger of Brabant. And a couple of scholars have reproduced Ruedi Imbach's arguments, either simply paraphrasing them, sometimes without mentioning the source, and I will not give the name again, or providing a misleading interpretation of Aquinas, and I will not give the name again. My own reading in respect to Ruedi Imbach's argument differs in what concerns the understanding of Siger of Brabant, and also I add to his contributions elements about the Western reception of this debate between Siger of Brabant and Aquinas that we have recently unveiled in our research project, and obviously Ruedi Imbach could not know when he wrote these articles. Right, so let's return to Aquinas' commentary on the sentences, where he discusses the philosophical possibility of the Eucharist in terms of separability of accidents from substance. On the one hand, he cites Avicenna in order to reshape the Aristotelian definition of the accident from esse in subjecto. Aquinas proposes esse in alio. According to this new definition of the accident does not have being only in a substance, but also another accident, in this case, in the quantity. On the other hand, he cites the Book of Causes and insists in the premises of his argument on the opposition removere remanere and on the superiority of the first cause adherence in respect to its effect. So I copied here his argument when he cites the Book of Causes, but I did not copy the argument when he cites Avicenna. The thesis of plus influere is the conclusion of the argument. Given that God is the first cause of both the accident and the substance, and that God can preserve in being, in esse conservare, both the accident and the substance, one can deduce with certitude that God can make, potest facere, accidents without their substance. In other words, God can make the effect of the secondary cause without the secondary cause. And in the case of the Eucharist, the qualities of red and white, taste, and so on red and taste for the wine, and white and the taste of the bread for the consecrated bread. So they subsist. We can taste the accidents. Nevertheless, the substance is different. How can he make them? Well, he can preserve in being the accidents, those accidents, and he can change, but the substance is changed, right? Because the accidents do not have esse in subjecto, in the subjects, but in alio, it is in the quantity they subsist. Red and taste of the wine subsists in the quantity of the wine, and so on. Well, this interpretation of the immediate intervention of God, or the first cause, does not correspond to the general idea described in the Book of Causes, let alone its remote source, the Elements of Theology. Aquinas' hermeneutic turn is based once again on a strong reading of the verbs removere and separare that the Book of Causes uses, as I mentioned, in relation to the secondary causes in the fragments that I cited above. It is also worth observing that the sentence in esse conservare sine objecto from the premises becomes in the conclusion facere sine subjecto. So from the conservation, he changes to production to of accidents and substance. It is an interesting modification that he will not copy or preserved in another text, in the Quodlibet 9.3. In this later text, Aquinas explicitly attributes the Book of Causes to Aristotle, because it was the case until he knew the translation of Moerbeke. So he attributes the Book of Causes to Aristotle and introduces a distinction between the natural order of things and the extraordinary nature of God's intervention in the world during the Eucharist. Another important aspect present in the Quodlibet and absent in the commentary on the sentences is his insistence on the fact that the first cause can act on the effect of secondary causes only if there is an essential order between these causes. One last difference between these two texts of Aquinas is that Aquinas talks about the subsistence of accidents without their substance, but not, this is in the Quodlibet, but not about their immediate production without the participation of the secondary causes. All these important differences between the sentences and the Quodlibet would not have prompted the well-known figure Siger of Brabant to react against Aquinas. But the argumentation from the sentences is more problematic as Siger argues in his commentary on the Book of Causes. Siger knew well Aquinas' texts and reacts against them, and he cites Averroes using a typical vocabulary of the Book of Causes, that the first cause cannot act nor produce the effect of the secondary cause without the participation of the later. If it were the case, the secondary causes would not actualize their essential operations, but according to the teleological, Aristotelian principle, all beings exist for the sake of their essential operations. And therefore, if God suspended their actions, the existence of the secondary causes would be in vain. But God and nature do nothing in vain. Okay, so he copies this argument from Averroes' book 9, commentary on the 9th book of the Metaphysics that you find here, where Averroes explicitly argues against the creation sine medio by the first cause, but but Averroes aims or organizes his argument against Al-Ghazali's occasionalism. So his fight, Averroes' fight here, is against Al-Ghazali's occasionalism. Well, the interesting fact is that with Siger of Brabant, we can clearly observe the beginning of an exegetical tradition in the Latin West that first spreads at the University of Paris at the end of the 13th century and is transferred or continued at the University of Prague in the 15th century. A Parisian anonymous author that you can see, well, I copied, I pasted some images from the manuscripts. A Parisian anonymous master of arts, active before 1277, hence a contemporary of Siger and Aquinas, writes a commentary on the Book of Causes, of which only a short fragment survived, immediately copied, as you can see here, after the text itself of the Book of Causes in a manuscript from the National Library in Paris. I gave him the sobriquet Sectator Philosophiae because the author describes himself as belonging to the sect of philosophers who do not discuss topics pertaining to faith. And he presents himself as such precisely when he introduces the question of the Eucharist miracle, and immediately adds the same reference to Averroes' commentary on the book 9 of the Metaphysics, as we saw in Siger of Brabant, and a certain number of ideas and words that are copied from Siger of Brabant. It is obvious that the anonymous master knows both Aquinas and Siger, but he provides a different solution from Siger. The anonymous master is not focused, as Siger of Brabant and Averroes, on the essential operations of secondary causes, but on temporality. He argues that everything from the sublunar world is generable and corruptible, hence temporal. It is impossible to imagine time without the movement of the celestial orb, he says. Hence, everything produced in this world necessarily is produced through or with the participation of the celestial movement or orb. Excluding the participation of this intermediary and assuming God's immediate participation in the world would exclude temporality from our sublunar world, which is absurd, he says. Another Parisian master of arts and contemporary of Siger of Brabant, John of Malinge, whom I mentioned in the beginning of my talk, wrote a commentary on the Book of Causes, preserved in a manuscript from Worcester. He uses many of Siger's arguments and even recognizes that the reference to Averroes is taken from a different source, aliquid dicunt quod secundum quod vult Averrois, and so on. John also uses the anonymous argument on the role of the celestial orb, but he adds that God produces the effects through intermediary causes, although he could create everything immediately. Because he wishes, but so if God creates through intermediaries, it is because God wishes to share his causal dispositions or powers with others. Propter communicabilitatem et largitatem non vult sola existere sine alis et similiter alis communicat causationem. John's idea is John's interesting idea of a social God, if we can say so, appears also in Thomas of York's Sapientiale. Radulfus Brito, a famous Parisian master from the end of the 13th century, writes in his commentary on the Book of Causes that faith and reason present different positions on occasionalism, and Radulfus defends the position of the theologians, although one has to admit that he rarely tries to provide any solid philosophical counter-argument. His main statement in favor of God's immediate intervention in the world is God's immutable will. He can immediately produce a plurality of effects, and all of them would still preserve their specific operations. I mention here another anonymous Parisian master from the beginning of the 14th century, who writes a commentary on the Book of Causes where he argues, after citing the same passage from Averroes' commentary on the 9th book of the Metaphysics, that the first cause acts upon the effects of the secondary causes, yet preserving their specific operations. Hence, the effect is not attributed exclusively to the first cause, but also to the secondary causes. The anonymous author equally develops the idea of God's immutable will and introduces the classical distinction between God's operations by intellect and by nature. God's operation by intellect is the result of his will. If he wanted to produce an effect in the same manner as the secondary cause produces, he would definitely do so. In other words, if God wanted to act immediately in the world, he could do it because his action does not depend on the secondary causes or on the specificities of the effect. God's operation by nature, on the other hand, or according to the order of nature, cannot be accomplished without the participation of secondary causes. And in order to emphasize his thesis, he explicitly cites theorem 28 of the Elements of Theology, where you see here at the end of the citation, where Proclus argues that every producing cause brings into existence things like to itself before the unlike. The anonymous author does not reject the necessity of the instrumental causality, but he carefully wishes to liberate God's absolute power from a necessitaristic, obstructive causality. Well, the debates, and I'm almost done, the debates on God's immediate intervention in the world with explicit references to Averroes' arguments from the Metaphysics Book 9 appears to have been a common feature for Parisian masters, as I show, commenting on the first theorem of the Book of Causes. But this tradition, as I mentioned at the beginning, is continued or revived at the University of Prague 1 century later, more precisely between 1400 and 1417. Julia Secchi from our research team is currently studying these texts from the University of Prague, and she intends to publish them in the near future. Therefore, I will cite here only the text that she has recently published and I will not mention the unpublished material if you agree with that. I will mention here the quadrilateral disputes by a master Simon of Tischnau, a rather controversial figure who until 1419 supported Jan Hus. He then changed his mind and criticized the Hussites. The question where we find our discussion about the possibility of production without the participation of secondary causes was attributed by Simon of Tischnau to Quodlibetarius, but we do not know the name of this master. Hence, we do not have the answer, if you want, or the solution of the master, but we still gather important information from the structure of the text preserved, where Simon, following the custom of the University of Prague, copied down some of the most relevant arguments against and in favor of the thesis. We also know that Simon copied and transmitted arguments that were in use at the University of Prague, like a stock of arguments that formed a local philosophical tradition to which it was possible to add more or less original ideas. In the title of this question that you can see here on the slide, you can recognize the debates about the possibility of immediate creation by the first cause. And you also have the reference here down below to Averroes' commentary on the book 9 of the Metaphysics. The general framework remains the same, even if these quadrilateral questions were discussed at Prague only by the masters of the Faculty of Arts. So they are dealing with the same problem called miraculous intervention in the world, although they were masters of arts, so concerned by philosophical problems. Many of the texts that are the quadlibeta from that period use the same idea of intervention without secondary cause, creation without any secondary cause. So if you want, there is a pattern, there is a tradition of discussion of the same problems at the University of Prague at the beginning of the 15th century as it was in Paris at the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century. So now some conclusive remarks. I think some of them are obvious, although unexpected, I dare to say, such as the long history of plus influere sine secundaria, connecting Averroes' polemic against Al-Ghazali, Siger of Brabant polemic against Thomas of Aquinas, and Jan Hus' colleagues from the University of Prague. It is clear, however, that when Siger cited Averroes and the subsequent Latin authors walking into his footsteps, the polemic against the Asherite occasionalism was not only irrelevant, but most probably completely ignored by the Latin authors. Averroes' polemic was simply extracted from its original framework and given a new life in a typically Christian context, the debate on the Eucharist. To Averroes' arguments, one should equally add, as I previously mentioned, the authority of Avicenna and not least the Book of Causes used by Aquinas, and we have an interesting bouquet of Islamic sources with an important impact on the debate on Eucharist in the Latin West. Another aspect that one can notice is that the authors found original arguments within the apparently repetitive exercise of structured commentaries or quadrilateral disputes in the medieval universities. However, it is fascinating to observe also the constitution of local philosophical traditions at the University of Paris or at the University of Prague, but also the connections between various universities throughout the centuries, the circulation, or rather the acclimatization of already established traditions in new academic environments. And finally, the history of manuscripts and commentaries on the Book of Causes exposes not only on unforeseen texts and arguments of the Western thought, but also seem to indicate that its successful diffusion of the Book of Causes, is due to its plastic metaphysics. Clearly not Aristotle and structurally different from Proclus, yet preserving a certain form of equivocal authority in the shadows, its metaphysics could be stretched in multiple directions, used in various polemics, recycled in new circumstances. The beautiful paradox of the Western reception of the Book of Causes is that the text did not lose its authoritative weight when it was deprived from the authority of Aristotle, nor it gained any weight when attributed here and there to Proclus. In the end, for the Latin authors, Proclus would not compete with Aristotle in terms of weight and prestige, right? With rare and notable exceptions, he did not inspire much enthusiasm in the Latin West. The Book of Causes remained authoritative and gained authority within the exegetical tradition developed in universities, schools, and studia. It remained important because it continued to fuel arguments. Hence, it continued to be cited, studied, commented, and not vice versa. It was not studied or cited because it was an important Aristotelian text, as some scholars would still argue today. In the end, the question that I raised, what kind of Neoplatonism did the Book of Causes spread in the Middle Ages? The only reliable answer is the Neoplatonism that could incorporate the philosophical or theological interests of each author depending on the context of his commentary or citation. In other words, it is the same plastic Neoplatonism that enabled the significant transformation of the elements of theology into the Book of Causes in the 9th century Baghdad. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dragos, for that characteristically magisterial presentation. Questions?
It seems that everything is clear. I'm very happy for that. I wished it was for me as well.
Why do you think, if I may just start off, why do you think that the initial error that you present as being not just an error committed by the angelic doctor, but various more modern scholars, why do you think that was so prevalent? Was it just the authority of Aquinas, or?
I think on the one hand, it's the authority of Aquinas. On the other hand, it's the idea that the Book of Causes is a short text, so without much importance. Also, there was a widespread idea that its impact was relatively low on the Latin West because we only had a few commentaries, and nothing really happened after Aquinas' commentary, which is incorrect. So if people did not read the text, why should we really consider it that carefully? Also, well, Aquinas proved that, well, actually is a summary of the elements of theology. So in general, historiography does not like second-hand literature, marginal authors. There is a pleasure to have heroes, intellectual heroes, big names, big books, big titles, and so on. I think that actually more I work on this medieval text, more I'm convinced that information circulated in various manners, not only through big authors and big titles, especially it circulated through Philologia. So there must be, I suppose, a certain number of received views in historiography that obstructed the real research on the Book of Causes. However, I don't want to neglect the importance of the works by Christina d'Ancona and Richard Taylor and a few others. But once again, their publications, although very important, are spread here and there, and we lack a monograph, a running commentary of the Book of Causes, establishing all the differences between the two texts. And once we would have that, it would be much easier to understand them. Even these scholars that I mentioned, they do not have a list of the differences between the two texts.
Yeah. And one other point before I'm just looking to see to make sure there's no other questions. You mentioned obviously the egregious differences in the absence of explicit reference to the one or the henads. But clearly, given the monotheistic context of the Liber de Causis in the Christian as well as in the Arab context, then obviously that does make sense, does it not? That
yes, of course. Yeah, it makes sense not to have the one henad's participation and so on. But it's precisely because we lack all these important elements in Proclus, we can't simply say that it's a compilation. It's a different metaphysical text, inspired by Proclus mainly, but also by Plotinus, by Aristotle, by the Quran, and so on. I was just emphasizing this widespread idea, and then I wanted to show that because we have the idea of influence or the concept of influence, which is typically for the Book of Causes and absent in the elements of theology, we could have this discussion on the Eucharist and the Book of Causes cited as an authority. Without this major difference, doctrinal difference between the elements of theology and the Book of Causes, the discussion that we have here would have been different, if you want, or at least not with these authorities or not in these terms.
Okay. Joshua.
Yes, thank you, Professor Calma, for the wonderful presentation. I'm a graduate student at Boston College in theology, and I'm very much interested in Neoplatonism. And my question, and I hope it's not too far out of the scope of this presentation, but in the Oxford edition of Proclus Elements of Theology, in the introduction by E.R. Dodds, he says that Dionysius specifically was his Christian imitator, and I believe I've heard different counts, but between 1,700 and 2,000 times Thomas Aquinas cites Pseudo Dionysius, and if Dionysius is drawing from Proclus, and Aquinas is drawing from these two sources, he's not directly drawing from Proclus, he's drawing from the Book of Causes, but he's also getting Proclus through Pseudo Dionysius. Maybe would you say that possibly some of the elements that are missing in the Book of Causes are sort of recuperated through through Pseudo-Dionysius?
I think there are several questions in your question, actually. But the first question that I would like to answer quickly is that it is true that Dionysius historically was inspired by Proclus, but Aquinas did not know that. He thought that Proclus corrupted Dionysius because Dionysius was the first disciple of St. Paul from the Acts of the Apostle, the famous discourse on the Areopagite. So for Aquinas, if you want, the chronology was totally reversed, right? So Proclus was the pagan who corrupted Dionysius, and there are a few pages in the commentary on the Book of Causes where. And this is, I answer to your, if you want, second question, if I delimited them as such. In the commentary on the Book of Causes, Aquinas corrects, as he says, the saying of Proclus by citing Dionysius the Areopagite, which is somehow curious for us or unusual for us, but we should know that he had a different chronology in mind. So if you want, given these historical perspectives, it's clear that for Aquinas, the Book of Causes did not have the same source as Dionysius, because Dionysius was before Proclus. So you have Dionysius, Proclus who corrupted Dionysius, and then you have the Book of Causes in the Arabic world who transformed Proclus. So if you want, there is a sort of the wise wisdom of the Christian thought of St. Paul is transformed twice, once by the pagan Proclus and the second time by the Arabs. So for him, it was not possible to reconstruct, if you want, a Dionysius through the Liber de Causis, for the Book of Causes. So this would change a bit he obviously is correct, Dodds, when he said that, but historically speaking, for Aquinas, things were different.
Thank you.
We have another question, from Mr. Joey B. Or at least that's what I've got in front of my screen. I think you're muted.
Or at least we can't hear you.
Can't hear you.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Professor Calma. Just kind of, sort of in the same vein as Josh's question. I didn't quite remember exactly the citation from Aquinas' commentary on the sentences, but at least in the third part of the Summa, where he's treating the accidents that remain, he doesn't seem to use the language of superfluere, but the idea of the primary cause remaining even when secondary causes are taken away is there. Is there something, or is there some kind of reason why it doesn't seem that in the third part of the Summa, which should be after he's done his commentary on the Book of Causes and after he's done his commentary on the divine names, he doesn't use the language of influre?
Well, it's a good question, and I did not mention that Aquinas uses explicitly the causes only in these two texts when discussing the Eucharist. The other texts in Aquinas, obviously, where he discusses the Eucharist, but he doesn't use the Book of Causes. And also there are other places in his works where he discusses the first proposition of the causes of the Book of Causes, but he does not refer to the accidents. Even in his commentary on the Book of Causes, he does not mention the accidents at all. It links it to the essential order of causes and so on. So he is interested in other themes. So these two specific texts in the sentences and the quote debate are the only the only fragments where the two problems are together. And I was interested in only in one of them, in the sentences, because it has this long history until the 15th century, which was ignored previously, if you want. Now, the explanation in the Summa Theologiae is different. I'm not sure if there is any sort of, if you want, a reaction to discussions that happened in the milieu against Aquinas on this aspect, because he was already immediately criticized by a certain number of authors on this problem, or whether he changed his thoughts because he realized that probably it was not that convincing, his own argument using the causes and influere. I'm not able to answer this question extremely in a very accurate way, but the differences are there, and you did well by pointing them out. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Did John have a question?
I can't see another hand up at the moment.
Well, I had one that was not well formed, but I can give you a bit of a morass. I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about Averroes' attack on occasionalism and how that played into all this, particularly something that came up a few times is the powers distinction between ordained and absolute power, at least in the background of what you were saying, I thought. So for those of us who are sort of tangentially connected, I would love to hear a little bit more about that connection, if you can do it.
Yeah, sure. Well, Averroes' reaction against the Asherite occasionalism is one of the main topics of his incoherence, his reaction against Al-Ghazali's text, the incoherence of the philosophers, where he attacks at numerous occasions his own view. And he's not the only one, by the way. Maimonides also attacks the same idea of the Asherites in his Guide of the Perplexed. So the text in the Metaphysics 9, it's a very short text. There are only a few lines where Averroes criticizes Al-Ghazali. I think there are about up to 10 lines or something like that. He develops the argument in the incoherence of the incoherence, but this text was not known to the medieval authors because it was translated late in Latin in a later stage. So at least authors like Aquinas, the 13th, 14th century authors would not know it. And those 10 lines, so if you want, what the medieval authors knew from Averroes was almost nothing. They could not reconstruct the entire framework there of the debate. What they saw is that Averroes was criticizing some moderni who claimed that causa prima, or God, can create sine medio everything in the world. Well, the general debate, if this is what interests you, is Al-Ghazali's famous idea that the world is created at every instant by God from atoms. God creates atoms that last 1 instant, and immediately after being created, they disappear and God recreates the world again. So God creates and recreates the world again and again and again and again, infinitely infinite times, if you want. From this idea of atomism and occasionalism, so these two theories are very important to understand Al-Ghazali's theory. And Al-Ghazali derives a different idea of causality than what we have in Aristotle. He would say that given that God creates and recreates the world at every instant out of atoms, it is only our impression, a wrong impression, when we attribute any form of causality between two objects, like fire and cotton. He gives this important example, which is quoted by some authors in the Latin West as well. He said, well, actually, there's no proof that fire would burst the cotton. The only thing that we can say is that in instant 1, we have fire and cotton. Instant 2, we have fire and cotton together. And instant 3, we have fire without cotton. And we, in our head, through our rationality, make a connection, a causality, a causal connection between these three moments. But in fact, it is God that creates all these elements as such, and he has the habit, he uses this term, he has the habit to create the same things in the same manner. So if we see the fire destroying the cotton once, and we see it twice and 3 times, and each time, it is because God has this habit to put them together, if you want. There's no real causality between them, because once again, there's no time to have any connection between two objects in the world, because they appear and they instantly disappear. Basically there's no time to connect, to have any causal connection between them. Well, in this case, obviously everything that is done, even my thirst, my thoughts, my movement, everything is created in a certain manner by God directly. Well, now there's a debate between scholars whether Al-Ghazali was really an occasionalist, or he would also accept the idea that intermediary causes participate to the creation. But let's say that Averroes did not bother with this question in these terms. He would have this strong reading of Al-Ghazali. So in this case, when everything is done by God and nothing is created or through the participation of secondary causes, well, obviously, why would you then have a secondary causes at all? You wouldn't have them. They wouldn't exist, because if you had them, they would do nothing. They would be in vain. So their essential operations would not be put in act. They would be in vain as such. And nature and God create nothing in vain, right? So this is, if you want, the main framework of the argument of the debate. But the Latin authors didn't know anything or almost nothing from this debate. They only took these 5 or 7 lines from book 9 of the Metaphysics, and they made their own argument of it.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much.
Dragos, I wonder if you could tell us briefly, and perhaps to conclude, what you think the significance of the continued commentary tradition from Paris to Prague and beyond tells us about the role of Neoplatonism, let's say, in the Latin West?
It's an excellent question. I tried to answer to this in the end when I kind of tried to imagine this idea of a plastic Neoplatonism, which would in fact be used in various and different philosophical or theological contexts. What I want to say is that a commentary in 1215 in Paris would respond to problems that are typical for that period in Paris among the masters of arts. Whereas in Prague or in Erfurt or in Leipzig or in Uppsala, the same text, the Book of Causes, would be used in order to respond to other problems in other terms. So if you want, this kind of, the Neoplatonism that is made possible through the Book of Causes is very, very flexible. You wouldn't have probably the same flexibility with other Neoplatonic texts like Dionysius. You wouldn't use it in any matter on causality or on matter, on time, on soul. Whereas you can use, and it's obvious from what we see, that the Book of Causes has this plasticity, this flexibility to be adapted to the various problems. So in some aspects, in some moments of the history of the Western thought, it is read as a realistic text, proving the existence of ideas against the nominalists, which obviously is totally irrelevant for Roger Bacon, who would be more interested in understanding what the concept of fluere in is, causality from inside. Or at the 15th century, Erfurt master would try to see if the idea of plus in fluere, that is obviously used by the author of the Book of Causes in order to explain the causality of super-essential causes, can be applied to the four causes of Aristotle. And the efficient cause, does the efficient cause influence more than the material cause or not? Well, it's a different kind of answer. But the fact that the vocabulary is very common, cause means everything and can be applied to both super-essential causes and Aristotelian causes. Everything that is linked to soul, intelligence, and so on. It's a common vocabulary. The authors were familiar with them. So they can once again apply it as they want. It's like a modular text. It receives different shapes and forms according to the Western thought. So basically, studying the history of this text is writing or rewriting the history of Western thought more than writing the history of the reception of the Book of the Elements of Theology in the Arabic world. So there are different fields, honestly. Totally different fields of study.
Well, with that splendid thought, I think we should all say thank you very warmly to Professor Dragos Calma for giving us an illuminating paper this evening. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye to everybody.